What's going on, y'all? Good morning. God is good. God is great. And God is moving in this place. Just this morning, I really want to speak to somebody about just how we're not called to be comfortable Christians, how God has called us to go out, how God has called us to do so many different things, that we're not called to live in comfort, that we're not called to live in a day-to-day life. We're not called to fit into society. The scriptures, they sit there and they describe being in the world, but not of the world. They sit there and they talk about transformation of the mind and the shifting of the heart, that God is after your heart, and from this, your mind will be changed as well. That you can't feel something in your heart and your mind be in a different place, that God is here for your heart, and because of that, your mind would be shifted, that your thoughts would no longer be on worldly things. It would no longer be worldly thoughts, but they would be kingdom thoughts. That he would sit there and he would have dominion in your heart. And then, because of this, there would be a shifting in your mind. There would be a shifting in the way that you think and the things that you think. Just this morning, I want to talk to somebody today about just how God hasn't called us to be regular. God hasn't called us to fit in. God hasn't called us to fit into society out here. God has called us to go forth. God has called us to make disciples. God has called us to love your neighbor in a radical way, that they would know that we are His. That God called us to all these different things. He doesn't say, get a 9 to 5. He doesn't sit there and say any of these different things, Society says you need money to be happy. Society says you need fame, you need fortune, you need all these different things. But God says Jesus is enough. It says that, and He looked at us when we were at our worst, and He saw us, and He saw greatness. That while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I sit there and I think on how He was beaten, He was whipped, He carried a cross that weighed hundreds and hundreds of pounds after all these beatings. The fact that He was whipped 42 times for my sins, for my discretions. That when I wasn't enough, Jesus came in and He was more than enough. The fact that He knew no sin and yet He became sin for our sakes. The fact that we sit there and we try to live comfortable lives. We try to fit in. We're not called to fit in. We're called to stand out. We're called to go out. We're called to make a difference. We're called to change the world. We're called to see kingdom come. We're called to see will be done. Just this morning, I want to remind somebody out here today that God is moving. That God is doing a new thing. That we sit there and we look at the disciples, and not one of them worked a regular job out here, Not one of them lived into their old age. Not one of them really lived to an old age. Excuse me. We see that they were crucified upside down. We see that they were beheaded. We see that they were boiled in oil. We see that each and every one of them died a martyr's death because of what they believed in. That they didn't live their life as comfortable Christians. They didn't live their lives as comfortable followers of the gospel. That they would sit there and that they would go out. I'm reminded time and time again of the Apostle Paul, how he was beaten, how he was whipped, how he was left bloodied and bruised. How they would sit there and they'd beat him until the point where they thought he was dead. And yet, when they left, he'd get up, he'd brush himself off, and he'd go into the next city and do it again and preach the gospel of this Jesus who had encountered him, this Jesus who had changed his life, this Jesus who had not only changed his name but had changed his identity. He would no longer be Saul, but now he would be Paul. The fact that he was changed and now he would go for it. He was changed and now he would move. That the Spirit of the living God is going to call you to movement. We sit there and we see it. That they're not called to be comfortable. We're called to see fire. We're called to see kingdom come. We're called to see God's will be done. We're called to see all of Him and none of us. So just this morning, I want to remind somebody, it's not always about being comfortable. It's not always about what feels good to you. Sometimes it's about what your soul calls out for, what your soul longs for. That He is called the lover of our soul. The fact that He looked at us and that He loved us. The fact that He looked at us and He said, you. He said, I'll give it all up just for you. that He would encounter us today. You know, just in closing, I want to remind you guys, we're not called to be comfortable. We're called to be radical. We're called to have radical faith, radical love, all these different things, because we serve a radical God. We're not called to fit into society. We're called to stand out. I'm reminded of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they would not bow because of the God that they serve. We serve a holy God. We serve a righteous God, but yet we serve a personal God. And they knew that, and they understood that. You know, thank you guys so much for watching this morning. God bless. God is good. God is great. God is just moving in this place. Y'all have a good one.